So happy you're joining us. Thanks for being here. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted you're here. And I'm on a mission tonight to make you fall in love with the artist Keith Haring if you aren't already. All right. Well, let's get started. Officially, again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Tonight is a partnered presentation. We have multiple libraries, multiple communities joining us. My name is Jane Oneail, and I own the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in putting together art appreciation programs like this one, and this is one of my favorites. So we're all in for a treat for tonight. I'm so delighted that you've taken time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Keith Haring. And like I said, there's a pretty good chance you're going to fall in love with him in the next hour. So, what we see on the screen is sort of what we're going to get because these little dancing figures in blue along the bottom, if you didn't know the name Keith Haring, you definitely know the dancing figures, right? Keith Haring was an art world celebrity. He was a pop culture icon. And those little dancing figures sort of came to represent the decade of the 1980s, didn't they? And what we see in this image that we have here is, in addition to the dancing, we've got a world that's kind of radiating energy, maybe joy. It's encircled in a heart that's also radiating, and it's being held together by these giant hands. Whose hands are these? That sort of spiral off like slinkies into the distance. So the overarching message here is love, right? Love and joy. And we will see that those are two resounding and recurring themes in the work of Keith Haring. So tonight we're going to get a sense of who this artist was and what his interests were, what sort of drove him and catapulted him to fame in the 1980s. And then we'll see where this work takes him and some of the advocacy that he did as well. So, with that being said, let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our hour together. This is an image of the artist as a young man, Keith Haring. We're going to get started with a quick introduction to the artist. We'll turn our attention to his graffiti art, his subway drawings, and then sort of track this meteoric rise to fame that he had following his sort of public art that was the graffiti he was doing in New York City. From there, we will take a look at his commercial success. And Keith Haring, probably more than any other neo pop artist, had incredible commercial success. Some of it might put a bad taste in your mouth. Yeah, I don't know. But he will redeem himself with his public projects and with the advocacy that he did, particularly around the issue of AIDS. We'll wrap up with his legacy, and that's when you'll fall in love. So let's get started with our introduction to the artist Keith Haring. We see him here as a little boy. He grew up about a half an hour outside of Allenstown, Pennsylvania. He was born in 1958. So, part of this great little nuclear family, he was the oldest of what would be eventually four children, the only boy in the family. And he had a particularly close connection with his father. His father was an amateur cartoonist and would sort of prompt his young son, even at the age of like 1 year old, he would prompt his young son to be thinking about drawing. Initially, they would kind of draw together, and then his father, with his son on his lap, would draw like a simple circle, give it to young Keith Haring, and prompt him to sort of make a face or something from the initial shape. So he was thinking creatively, and he was thinking like an artist from a very young age. Don't you just love these tweenage year pictures over here on the left? They're very endearing. So, born in 1958, Keith Haring grew up in the 1960s. He saw all of that tumult that was happening, all of these cultural revolutions, but he was really too young to participate in them. He was aware of them, though, and that social consciousness we will see infiltrates into his artwork in the 1980s. Now, I love this image over here on the right because he's just sitting on his bed here. And as a young child, this is a boy who kind of almost like squirreled himself away from society to a certain extent because he was just so focused on drawing. His emphasis was always making art. He started off with these prompts from his father, and then he just wanted to make art going forward. Just beyond him, we see the image of Snoopy. And of course, Charles Schulz was an influence on the artist. He also cited Walt Disney and Dr. Seuss as being particular influences on him as well. We'll see a little bit more of that Walt Disney as we move through today's program. Now, at the tender age of 10, he wrote for a school assignment, "When I grow up, I would like to be an artist in France. The reason is because I like to draw. I would get my money from the pictures I would sell. I hope I will be one." So sweet, right? Well, spoiler alert, it works out for him. We're going to see how he's selling his art as a professional artist and how he makes it to France as well. So when he is done with high school, it's 1976. It's a little bit of a grainy picture, but we see he's got the long hair and, of course, his gown on here. Where does he go from, the rural Pennsylvania? Where he go? Well, he goes to the next big city, which was Pittsburgh, and he goes there to study commercial art. And a few important things happen while he's studying commercial art. First, he's kind of turned off by the whole thing because everyone he's encountering, from his professors to his fellow students, are all talking about how the commercial art pays the bills, but they all have passion projects that really move them and drive them and, keep them going every day. And for Keith Haring, he thought, well, why do the commercial work? Just follow your passion. And that's what we will see he does during his lifetime. The other important thing that happens, well, there's a number of important things. He's already getting his first solo exhibition as a young man living in Pittsburgh. But another important thing happens to him, and that is he begins to study just a little bit of art history. And there are two artists who were roughly contemporary to him who had a big impact on the way Keith Haring thought about art. The first is Jackson Pollock, whose work Convergence from the 1950s over here on the left, we can see. The second is Christo and Jean-Claude, whose work Running Fence from the early 1970s we see over here on the right. Now, how do these works inspire or influence the work of Keith Haring? When we look at Jackson Pollock, an artist that we know sort of danced out his paintings that when he laid his canvas flat out on his floor, um, Jackson Pollock went into like a little bit of a trance when he was making these paintings. And what we will see is that Keith Haring sort of does the same thing. I don't know if he was necessarily trying to seek, access to his unconscious while he was doing it, but there was this notion of sort of accessing another part of his mind sometimes while he was creating these works. We can also see with Jackson Pollock's work that it almost feels like there's no right way up. This is all over painting. The picture isn't necessarily oriented in a certain direction. You could flip it upside down and hang it the same way and probably have as satisfactory of an experience looking at it. And what we will see is that some of Keith Haring's work is like that too. It's all over art. When it comes to Christo and Jean-Claude over here, they would make these big ephemeral projects. This is called Running Fence. It was a 24-mile, 18-foot high fabric curtain that ran through multiple counties in Northern California. Just to create something like this required the buy-in from private property owners and small communities and all of these people. And they really considered that persuasive element to be part of their art. So they documented, the town meetings and the pushback and all of that. It was all part of the project. And for Keith Haring, he loved that Christo and Jean-Claude were doing something that was public and that sort of brought art to everyone. What we will see is that was probably Keith Haring's most firmly felt belief around art, that art should be for everyone. We'll see that play out in many ways. So we have this artistic influence already, and then we have Keith Haring moving from Pittsburgh to New York City. And he moves to New York City to study at the School of Visual Arts. He is 20 years old. He's there to study sculpture and art history, a little bit of performance art. We'll see how that plays in too. And importantly, semiotics. So signs and symbols and the language of signs. And he was moving to New York City, right at the early 80s. This was a time where there was this incredible coming together of young, creative, sort of desperately broke people. But it was this creative environment that was sort of unparalleled. And we'll see how those relationships kind of spark so much in young Keith Haring. I'm going to use this sort of glazed over picture of him riding the subway as our segue to our next section, which is about street art and subway drawings. Okay, so Keith Haring is living in New York City in the age of graffiti art. There could be a brand new subway train that's put on the tracks one day, and the very next day it's shooting down the tracks looking like this. To be clear, neither one of these images represents Keith Haring's work, but he described the graffiti on the subway trains as being some of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He was transfixed by this. He also sort of had the sense that this was not the game or the mode of expression of young white men. And he didn't want to step on anyone's toes. So he's still kind of figuring out what works best for him. At this time, he also becomes very good friends with another up and coming artist named Jean-Michel Basquiat. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he's now recognized to be one of the most important artists from this era too. So here he is with Basquiat. On the right, we can see an image of Basquiat with some of his spray paint graffiti art, which is mostly text-based. So again, Keith Haring has this kind of sense of like, okay, well, the world of graffiti art is sort of dominated by young Black men, young Hispanic men. Who am I as a white man to step into any of this? But it was a mode of expression that was so appealing to him. He attempts to sort of break into it. This is an example of some of his spray paint graffiti art, this Polaroid that we can see over here on the left, but it wasn't his primary mode of expression. What we see on the right is a collage of headlines and images from the New York Post, which tended to have these very tends still to have these very provocative, splashy headlines that capture people's attention. And he would cut them out and rephrase them in ways that kind of pointed to people in positions of power, issues of subjugation, that sort of thing. And once he made his new collage, here we have Reagan slain by hero cop, he would make multiples of them, make a ton of copies, and then kind of plaster them all over lampposts and the sides of buildings in lower Manhattan. So people did not have a choice as to whether or not they wanted to see them. If you were walking to work down the sidewalk one day, you would be confronted by these images. And he really liked that. It's that idea that art is for everyone. But he still hadn't quite landed on his best mode of expression. And when he did, it was actually underground, literally. So, what Keith Haring sort of one day discovers, has this epiphany over, is that in the New York City subway system, there were paid advertisements, as there are today. And when a paid advertisement expired, the subway system would just put a piece of matte black paper over that expired ad, just so that nobody would be exposed to it beyond what they had paid for. And so these pieces of black paper just existed all over the subway system. And one day Keith Haring thought, that's my canvas. And he went up to the surface, to the street level. He went into a corner store, he bought some chalk, he went back down into the subway, and he just started drawing. The little boy who couldn't stop drawing is now drawing in the subway. And yes, this is graffiti, even though chalk, you can wipe away. And even though this black matte paper was literally just a placeholder, this was still considered graffiti. Now, I love this image on the screen because here he is making graffiti, and there's a woman on a payphone. I don't think payphones even exist in New York City anymore. And she's just like making her call, even though there's somebody making graffiti right next to her. Now we can see a little bit about his approach here. First of all, he would almost always create the outline, almost like a cartoon border for his drawings. And then he would use these archetypal characters, these characters that are not necessarily male or female. They're not necessarily wearing specific clothing. They stand in for all of humanity, right? Sometimes positions like this suggest dancing. Sometimes it suggests something else. In this case, we have a figure that's being plucked up by a giant hand. What does, we can immediately determine what we're looking at, but the meaning of it is just a little bit ambiguous too, right? Okay, so this becomes his mode of expression. And as I've mentioned, this was still considered graffiti. We can see him looking over his shoulder, sort of cautiously, in both of these images as he's making this graffiti because he could be arrested for it at any time. We can also see how he extrapolates on those familiar chalk outline figures. And, sometimes he does some surrealist elements with like a very long neck over here. Sometimes he adds a television as a head. Sometimes it's a barking dog. What we'll see a lot of too is a crawling baby with these radiating lines on it. This almost becomes his self-portrait over the course of his career. So he's doing this quickly. It is still a crime, but he's also aware that he has an audience, and you can probably see it better in this image that we see over on the left. But even over here on the right, he is hard at work, and people who are traveling on the subway, who are just trying to get to their next destination, probably commuting to work, they're involved in the drudgery of everyday life. They have stopped and they are watching him create something out of nothing. And for Keith Haring, that performative aspect of his work was really gratifying. The other concept here is that many of the people that were riding the subway might not go to like a gallery opening or to a museum per se, but now they're being exposed to art. And now we have that idea of Keith Haring showing the world that art can be for everyone. And again, his figures are pretty accessible, right? When we look at these two examples here, we can get a sense in terms of his approach. Now, this is a person that's been creating these chalk outline characters probably for most of his life, right? His young life at this point. And we can see a sense of symmetry in this image over here on the left. But as we look a little bit closer, we can see the legs here are a little bit fudged. They're not exactly symmetrical. Even the heart's not symmetrical. But the basic idea, these two figures seemingly running towards each other or kind of dancing towards each other, they almost look like they're ready to give each other a high five, and a heart at the center of the composition gives us that sense of movement, that sense of joy, that sense of affection and love. It all comes together here. And the fact that it's not perfect per se does not matter. There's still this, I think, really appealing confidence in the way that he's created these characters, even if they're not perfectly symmetrical. Over here on the right, we have a squatting figure, very symmetrical squatting figure here. The number 83, probably because it's 1983. The figure has a giant heart-shaped head, and in this case, that radiating baby once again. So we get a sense in terms of how he could make these images and how he could use these characters, kind of swap them out. That goes back to his study of semiotics, right? We see that a little bit here too with two images that involve the spaceships. In this case, we've got the nuclear cooling tower. He did grow up in the era of 3 Mile Island, so he has this awareness of the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. But the spaceship can mean something totally different in depending on its context, and that goes back to semiotics again. Oops, sorry. So we oftentimes see a barking dog. It's not unusual for him to show a figure riding on the back of another creature, oftentimes holding a glowing sword. Could be a lightsaber, could be a sword. It's oftentimes a symbol of power or subjugation. So all of these things have variable meaning depending on how he puts it together. Because he is creating these images, with this sense that he could be caught at any moment. He was creating them so quickly. He could create probably one of these subway drawings I would say in about 5 minutes or so. And like I said, it's like the synthesis of the performative process, this kind of automatic creation, sort of similar to what we saw with Jackson Pollock, and then that notion of democratic access too. So all of these big ideas kind of coming together in these subway drawings, and people loved them. Keith Haring would make 40 subway drawings in a day. He's moving all over Manhattan, making a drawing in different parts of the city. And people that I know who lived in Manhattan at the time said it was absolutely thrilling to ride the subway. You'd be on the lookout for one of these images, and then you'd be overjoyed to see one of them. So he was like enhancing the lives of so many people and bringing art to everyone. Now, this got him attention. This got him noticed. In fact, this is a very fuzzy screen grab from CBS Sunday Morning News that was following him around making these subway drawings. Notice he's already branded himself with this radiating baby that becomes kind of his logo here. And for the cameras on CBS Sunday Morning, he's arrested for creating graffiti art with the subway chalk or with the chalk subway drawings. And he's, fined and released essentially. So this kind of shoots him to this place of celebrity. And this final picture or one of the final pictures that I have in this section here, I think is just so wonderful. Keith Haring had a photographer friend named Seng Kwon Chi, and he would tell Chi all of the places where he had done his subway drawings on any given day. He would record all of the addresses. Chi would go out and photograph all of them. I think this is a particularly compelling photograph because we can see that Haring has just finished this drawing that we can see through this closing subway door. It has these familiar elements, the chalk outline figure riding, in this case, like a centipede with a computer screen for a head. And it's as though Keith Haring has just slipped through the subway door. He's evading capture, right? And there's this wonderful sense of confidence as he's looking at us, the viewer, in this picture. He's also surrounded by this very different kind of graffiti that is all over the subway car that he is in. We can see that there's a clarity to the kinds of images that he was making that is so different from the kind of graffiti that was, ubiquitous in the city at this point. So these subway drawings became, like I said, catapulted him to fame at this time, and they became collector's items. People would tear them off of the walls of the subway as soon as they went up sometimes. So you can go on eBay, you can find some really questionable versions of Keith Haring's subway drawings. Don't pay $200 for them because I have a feeling those are not real, because some of these subway drawings are in museum collections today, like the ones that you see here. So he's getting noticed. He's getting noticed by all the right people. And this is that rise to fame and acclaim that we are going to take a look at, because all the right people in the art world are looking at Keith Haring's art. So while he's in the midst of making these subway drawings, the art establishment has noticed him. In the early 1980s, he gets his first gallery show, his first group exhibitions. He's invited to exhibit and paint in countries around the world. He is skyrocketed to an international success. Look at this gallery opening over here on the left. It's like people are elbow to elbow to look at his art, and it's all over the walls. Here he is on like a cherry picker type or scaffolding, making a mural inside of a museum setting here. Now here's a better picture. We can see Keith Haring wearing his Radiating Baby t-shirt, surrounded by his artwork. We see that familiar image of the two figures in front of the heart there. Now, for a mural on that scale, he could execute that in the space of about 2 hours and then sell it for about $15,000. So he was doing very well for himself at a very young age. He was in his early 20s and he found this remarkable success. And this was in like the elitist and very skeptical world of fine art. But he remained kind of true and passionate to his other interests that he had before he became rich and famous, that would move him from the world of fine art literally underground to underground dance clubs in this case. So Keith Haring loved to dance. He loved the club scene. Notice the decoration here over this dancing crowd is a Keith Haring mural, and this is our artist right here at the center of the composition, having a cathartic experience on the dance floor. Right, this is a man who just loved the environment of a pulsing nightclub. And this was one of his favorite places. This was the Paradise Garage. And this was a place that was like black, white, multicultural, gay, straight, just accepting to everyone. And this was like a home for him. Even as he started to get like these international commissions, he would plan his schedule around like flying back into New York City so that he could dance at this club over the weekend. And all of a sudden, the dancing figures, they make sense, right? I mean, especially when they're in like these kind of weird positions, because this is a man that really just let loose and expressed himself in that dancing environment. And now we can see too, with a little bit of color, why he chooses to add color to these figures, because he wants to express that the dancing was a way to unify people of all different stripes here. So the club scene was integral sort of to his integration into the culture of lower Manhattan in the early 1980s. One of the first clubs that he would frequent was called Club 57. Here he is at an open mic night where he's holding this television screen over his head or framing his face while he's reciting some poetry. He's, literally a talking head. And then over here, a little bit later, he did this huge mural for the Palladium nightclub. This is much later work here, but he's so connected to the club scene. And here we can see him in a nightclub. You've probably already recognized some of the other famous people in the scene here, but it was Club 57 that was this hive of creative minds. You had people like Cyndi Lauper and the B-52s and RuPaul and Fab Five Freddy. They're all coming into the space. They're all rubbing elbows with each other. And like the electricity from all that creativity, I think really inspired Keith Haring. Now, in this case, we can see Jean-Michel Basquiat over here. We can see Madonna at the center of both of these photos. And here she is admiring what I presume are some sketches from the artist himself, Keith Haring, who we see on the right in both of these images. Now, he and Madonna would become good friends. In fact, she would later say that they were this different sides of the same coin. And here he is standing behind Madonna, who is wearing a leather jacket that he has painted. How perfect is it, too, that he's sort of created an image of the Madonna and child right there on the jacket to honor Madonna. Over on the left, he has altered two covers of the New York Post, sort of going back to his graffiti roots there. He loved the headlines of the graffiti post, but he's altered them just ever so slightly to include some of his familiar imagery, dancing figures, radiating babies. But these happen to be covers that reference Madonna. And I particularly love this headline, Madonna on nude pics. So what? Well, he altered these covers of the New York Post as wedding presents for her when she got married in 1985 to Sean Penn. So what a great gift, right? We can see Keith Haring over here with none other than Andy Warhol carrying those New York Post covers to Madonna's wedding. Now, his relationship with the artist Andy Warhol was absolutely essential to Keith Haring's fame. Now, Andy Warhol is an artist that came to fame 2 decades earlier. He was the king of pop, right? Known for creating these images of like Campbell's soup cans and that sort of thing. He was a boundary breaker, and he was also somebody who married commercialism with the world of fine art in a really interesting way. He called his studio the factory. Well, 2 decades on, Andy Warhol he's maintaining his interest in celebrity, but I think sort of like um, Oprah Winfrey, like he wanted to maintain some relevance by talking about his favorite things. And his favorite things were these two young artists, Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat. And by being selected by Andy Warhol, it was essentially a coronation into the art world. And so Keith Haring gets sort of lumped into this category of being a pop artist, and he honors Andy Warhol in so many ways in his art. He sort of launching from that early admiration of Walt Disney, he creates the character of Andy Mouse, roughly inspired by Mickey Mouse. And Andy Warhol, is an icon. Oftentimes, Andy Mouse is surrounded by dollar bills and dollar signs, and it's not cynical. It's not that Andy Warhol has sold out. It's more that Andy Warhol, or Andy Mouse in this case, is living the American dream. He's an artist that stayed true to his vision, and he found fortune in fame in doing that. I mean, look at how those familiar herring dancing figures are propping up that Andy Mouse there, right? Andy Warhol returns the favor by creating this kind of dreamy silkscreen portrait of Keith Haring. And I think that in this case, it's on a T-shirt for whatever reason. And Keith Haring added his own little Andy Mouse to it. I'm sure that this is a high-priced collector's item at this point. So being friends with Andy Warhol, it opened doors, but it also it provided for a lot of introductions in Keith Haring's life. So Keith Haring was hired by Andy Warhol to paint the body of Grace Jones, the model, for Interview magazine, for Andy Warhol's magazine. Now this is an intimate task, right? And Keith Haring and Grace Jones became fast friends because of this assignment, and they would go clubbing together for years to come after this. Over here, we can see, and this is just one of the things that helps to launch Keith Haring towards a life of fame. Over here on the right, we can see him surrounded by the members of the groundbreaking hip hop group Run DMC. They are posing against a backdrop of Keith Haring's spray painted graffiti in this case. I think this is for an Adidas ad. So Andy Warhol is helping Keith Haring to become a celebrity. And I think you've maybe reached the heights of your celebrity when you become friends with Yoko Ono. And Keith Haring is pictured on the left and the right with Yoko Ono. Here she's with her son, and here they are with Keith Haring's parents. Imagine what they were thinking. They had their son in the late 1950s. Now he's in his 20s and he's friends with Yoko Ono. I mean, that must have been mind blowing. You get the sense that they're pretty proud. Keith Haring, not surprisingly, partnered with Yoko Ono. They had this love of music, this love of dance, and so there was like a week long program around contemporary dance, and they collaborated on the music and some of the graphics for the marketing materials here. So very appropriate, right? But these next four images related to Yoko Ono in this case, I think are just so mind-blowing. On the occasion of her son Sean's 9th birthday, he was given a Macintosh computer. And who is there to help orient him to this new purchase? None other than Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is there with Andy Warhol and Keith Haring and other people, and they're all hanging out in 9-year-old Sean Lennon's bedroom at the Dakota at their apartment building in New York City. So you've got this incredible brain trust in this child's room. What are they talking about, right? Well, look what's on the screen of his brand new computer. It's a Keith Haring design. So Keith Haring's art and his ideas are at the center of this conversation. And what I wouldn't have given to have been a fly on the wall in that room that day. So Keith Haring has friends in all the right places, but he still had friends that were graffiti artists too. And this is actually a view of Keith Haring's apartment. I don't know that I have the date on this particular image, but we get a sense in terms of what his apartment looked like. And you're probably thinking right now, he didn't get his security deposit back, right? Because he invites over all these graffiti artist friends and they're like tagging his walls. And he invites everybody to sort of sign his refrigerator door here. We can also see things that he loved. There's like a Fred Flintstone here. There's a Mickey Mouse up here on the wall. Well, when Keith Haring moved out of this apartment, his landlord simply painted over all of the walls, but he left the refrigerator as is. And that meant that his next tenant inherited this graffiti covered refrigerator. And shortly after that, it broke down. The landlord brought it out to the sidewalk, was just going to junk it. And the next tenant had the foresight to think, I think this is important, and took the refrigerator door off of its hinges, put it into storage in their parents' attic for the next few months, and then recently sold it at auction for, I think, about $25,000. Because as it turns out, it's this refrigerator door and its graffiti and signatures acted as a ledger, like a guest ledger. And all of the most important movers and shakers of the 1980s had signed it. Now, I can't really deduce from most of the signatures here. I think the JM at the bottom is probably Jean-Michel Basquiat, but somewhere on this wall, I'm sure, or on the door here, is Andy Warhol's signature, and apparently Madonna wrote somewhere, "Madonna loves Keith." So the next time you're in an Airbnb, if you see a little graffiti, you might want to hang on to it. All right. So with all this said and done, he's the darling of the art world now. He's pop culture icon. Well, pop already had this kind of interesting relationship with commercialism. So, where does this lead for Keith Haring? Now, he is an artist who is famous for making these dancing figures, and something interesting started to happen. He had this recognizable style. His work was in front of millions of people already, and he started to hear from friends around the world in like Rio and in Tokyo. He's getting postcards, he's getting photographs that there are knockoffs of his work all over the planet. And so Keith Haring recognized, and this is him pointing to a t-shirt that or a sweatshirt here with knockoff dancing Keith Haring figures. So there's a demand for what he is doing. And Keith Haring, he's thinking art is for everyone. How can I satisfy that demand? Well, his solution was the pop shop. And the pop shop is basically, a way to sell pop art. It's almost like a museum store without a museum. The art world elite hated this idea. They thought it was like cheapening art, it was dumbing it down, it was like fast food for fine art, and it just didn't work. But this is the sort of thing that Andy Warhol gave his blessing to. So let's go inside the pop shop. Let's see. He started this, I believe, in 1986. I want to say, and it stayed open for nearly 2 decades. So inside the pop shop, he has completely decorated the interior. This is a little bit of that Jackson Pollock all over painting. There's no proper edge to any of this. You can understand it from any single direction. And you can see all of this work that has been licensed by Keith Haring, and it's all priced appropriately. You could get a pin with his radiating baby for about $3. So there's this notion that if you want Keith Haring's work, it is available to you and it's within the grasp of the average American. What's so bad about that, right? Here is Keith Haring inside the pop shop, standing very confidently here. We can see a few of the T-shirts in the background, including a T-shirt that features the likeness of Andy Warhol. Now, I already mentioned Andy Warhol was fascinated by this very fine line between the world of commercial art and fine art. And he talked about how he wanted to be a machine, how his studio was a factory. And you can see that Keith Haring was kind of grappling with the same ideas in his artwork from this time. We can see one of his familiar figures kind of befuddled by this machine and sort of yanking out another one of these figures too. So maybe here he's kind of ruminating on how do I become a fine artist that's also a commercial artist. Well, the pop shop closed eventually. I think it was in 2008. It closed its doors. Sorry, 2005. But those paintings that he had made for the interior were preserved, and they're actually at the New York History Museum, right over the counter where you buy your tickets. So it's kind of like your first glance at New York City when you walk into this museum. And of course, you can still buy the merch and those magnets and the pins and that sort of thing. The little radiant baby, sorry, there we go, is still within the grasp of the average person. They're still right there around $3. Now, from there, Keith Haring got a number of commercial opportunities. Remember Swatch watches? Is there anything um, more 1980s than a Swatch watch? The idea was high-minded design and low cost. They were about $50, right? Well, they commissioned him to do a series of 4 Swatch watches. A lot of familiar elements here, the dancing figures, like something that's sort of like a centipede. There's the world here that's kind of radiating joy. And in this case, this particular set, Keith Haring had signed the band. You can just see the K over here at the top on the left. And so somebody just a couple of years ago was trying to sell these 4 Swatch watches, which together would have cost about $20 when they were first made, trying to sell them for about $10,000 because they were signed by Keith Haring. He was also roped into making or contributing to the Absolute Vodka marketing campaign. You might remember back in the 1980s, you couldn't buy a Time or a Newsweek without an Absolute Vodka advertisement on the back of that magazine. Andy Warhol had already done his own treatment on Absolute Vodka with that sort of silkscreen effect. So he encouraged Keith Haring to do his own ad. And true to form, Keith Haring does the dancing figures, but he also kind of eyeballs the shape of that bottle. The shape of the bottle was like the crux of the ad campaign, right? But he doesn't go for the perfect symmetry because Keith Haring just goes for it. He doesn't do preparatory drawings at all. He just goes for it. And so that's what he did for this ad campaign too. And I mean, it's interesting to me that the vodka brand here knew that Haring's name, if not the imagery, was important enough here that it was all really compelling to audiences at the time. Haring was also commissioned to create designs on a variety of automobiles. This is a child-sized Ferrari. This is a Range Rover or Land Rover, I think, and then a BMW. And in every case that he's commissioned to do work like this, he would just show up with a boombox. He'd put his music on. He'd go into sort of like a Jackson Pollock type state, kind of tapping into this unconscious. And then it's this all over patterning. There's no true beginning or end to any of this. He just goes, he just creates. And this was his method. Now, since his death, his artwork has been licensed for a number of things, from like coffee or espresso cups to dog dishes. There's his familiar barking dog. I was really surprised to see that Abercrombie and Fitch had licensed some of his imagery as well. I guess MAC Cosmetics oftentimes uses his familiar designs for their makeup. And then, God, if you want a Keith Haring rug, you can order one through Ruggable these days. And even at the MoMA Design store, you can get objects that are sort of inspired by Keith Haring designs, including a chess set like the one that you see here. So there's like no end to the desire to buy Keith Haring inspired works. Even Lego came out with a Keith Haring set just this last fall. And if you love the figures that you're looking at here, I do kind of love the way that they've achieved those motion lines, the movement lines for this particular set. Costs about $120 to buy this set here. But if you're a big Keith Haring fan, it might be worth it. And then with things coming just full circle, what we're looking at here is a Funko Pop brand figurine that is the likeness of Keith Haring himself. So now he's become the collectible in all of this too. Now, if all of this is just leaving a really foul taste in your mouth, if you're just like, this is all just so crass and so commercial, it's not art, I'm not really that interested. I get you. But now it's time to redeem Keith Haring with his public projects because this might be where you really fall in love. So Keith Haring painted 50 major murals during the course of his career, which was really only about 10 years. Major murals around the world. About 31 of them still exist today. And many of his projects were to support causes that would support children too. So he had a very big heart. I want to show you one of his earliest mural projects, the Crack is Whack mural. Now, I just love to say crack is whack. This was a really important work that he did in New York City in 1986. This was an abandoned handball court. Does anybody play handball anymore? I don't know. But it was right next to this highway leading out of Harlem to the Bronx. He was driving down that road one day and he looked at that wall and he thought, that could be a billboard. And so one day he just bought the orange paint, he got a bunch of ladders, and he just showed up in that park to paint this mural. Now, crack had personally impacted him in that one of his studio assistants had become addicted to crack, and he saw firsthand that there were like no resources available to people who were suffering with this addiction. And he wanted to make a statement about it. So he just invited himself to this wall to create what was essentially a public message to the world. Crack is whack. We can see that there's like this figure that's being fed to a monster. There's money that's going up in flames. There's a crack pipe here. Now, I love this image over here while he's making the mural because a couple of kids have ridden up on their bikes and they're just sitting there watching him paint. And for Keith Haring, all of this is kind of a performance too. So I'm sure he loved that he had an audience. Now, Keith Haring was very against crack, but that didn't mean he was against all drugs because what was his kind of like fatal undoing in all of this is once he was done with the Crack is Whack mural, he sat down on like the sidewalk in front of this mural and he lit up a joint. And that's when the police rolled up and they asked him who he was and what he was doing there. Keith Haring had said, if you show up anywhere with a ladder, nobody asks you if you had permission to paint there. But apparently, if you show up with a joint, that's when the police roll up. So he gets arrested not only for the drug charge, but for the graffiti charge. And it becomes this thorny issue in the mayor's office because the mayor is definitely anti graffiti, but also anti crack. So, how do you handle this? And as he's grappling with that, all of a sudden this mural becomes like the linchpin for talking about the crack epidemic. It becomes this very powerful visual that's used in the news. It's even like people begin to use it in print material too that's related to education around crack. And people begin to see like what Keith Haring has actually contributed to this conversation. So the mayor lets him off with just a fine. And during this time, this decision making time, his Crack is Whack mural was defaced. Actually, somebody defaced it and altered it to Crack is it, like Coke is it, you know. And so the city actually invited him to repaint it. They said you can choose anywhere in the city, really. Just repaint, make a new Crack is Whack mural. It's important to us. And Keith Haring, to his credit, said, I'm going to repaint it in the exact same spot. But he came up with a new design. So this is Crack is Whack 2 that we're looking at. And I happen to think that this is a stronger design. This is kind of interesting because this is the head of the park system who's there wearing like a Keith Haring t-shirt and he's holding the umbrella. Now he's got the help of the parks department to make something like this. So this is Crack is Whack 2. It's recently been restored. It's this very large skeletal figure holding the crack pipe, burning their money. And now instead of feeding figure to a monster or whatever, it's just a dance party. It's actually a lot like the Absolute Vodka ad. But this dance party, people are overcome, people are dying. And it really reminds me of like medieval imagery of like scenes of hell, where there are all these nude figures kind of like writhing around in pain. So I think it's a really compelling image. He actually painted the back of the wall too. Typically, when you see his dancing figures with X's, that means that they have died. We've got the serpent that is that is the addiction chasing this figure here. So his painting helped to kind of uplift this little section of New York City and sort of gentrified it to a certain extent. And now there is a crack is whack playground, which I just find so funny. I can't imagine being like, let's get the baby in the stroller and go to crack is whack. But there it is. And I love that his legacy is preserved that way. Now, from this moment forward, Keith Haring is invited to create murals all over the world. This is him creating a mural that's in Melbourne, Australia. And here is the amazing thing. He would approach these murals in the exact same way that he did his subway drawings. There's no preparation. He just goes to work. And even Michelangelo, when he was creating the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he got down off the scaffolding. He looked up from the floor at the ceiling, 70 feet above his head, and he thought, is the scale and the proportion working? Keith Haring never did that. He just created. And so we can see he can take a design like this and turn it into this. So those familiar dancing figures now, are they climbing? Are they falling? We're not quite sure, but they're still legible. There's just enough ambiguity there to keep us interested. We have this centipede-like figure, a couple of human figures, one of them with that glowing sword, and then a sphinx-like front paws and a computer for a brain over here for that centipede. So the meaning, I think we could extrapolate a lot of different meanings here, but it is so characteristic of his style here that I think there was immediate appeal for something like this. Now, a museum in Amsterdam had this huge scrim that they needed to install in this atrium to help diffuse light in this space. And so they commissioned Keith Haring to spray paint this scrim. It was roughly like 70 by 40 feet. And he did it all in public in the course of just one day. So here is Keith Haring spray painting that scrim in his socks, and then it was installed. So he could work quickly, and he loved to do it in front of other people. And again, this is all done without any preparatory work. He just had a sense in terms of how to fill the space. Now, from there, it's 1986, and Keith Haring is invited to Berlin, Germany, to paint on the Berlin Wall. This is incredible, right? He's invited by the Checkpoint Charlie Museum. Now, this is like 6 feet into East Berlin. It's a crime to deface this wall, but he is there to do it because he believed that the wall was divisive. The wall represented, literally the division of people. The wall should come down. So in 1986, he goes there. A 300-foot section of the wall was painted yellow in advance of his arrival. And then he went and he painted these figures in black and in red. And they're kind of connected hand to foot this way. And he painted a 300-foot section of this wall in these colors that were associated with the traditional German flag. Now, it was dangerous to do this. Just above the wall here, you can see a guards tower from East Berlin. These were armed guards in that tower, and they could have shot him. This was illegal, right? And while he was there, it was a media sensation. He was surrounded by reporters who were documenting what he was doing. There was even a helicopter with an American news team in it, kind of buzzing him the whole time. He said he had never worked in such circus-like conditions. He completed that 300-foot section of the wall in 5 hours. And he felt like what he did was really important. He called it a humanistic gesture. And he said, even though it's essentially like a temporary art installation, it was an important political and subversive act. It was done to kind of psychologically destroy the wall. So here is this man who just like a few years earlier was doing graffiti art at the New York City subway, is now invited to do this incredibly important political art on the surface of the Berlin Wall. Even the New York Times wrote about it. They said that the entire world should know that it happened, reinforcing its political significance. Talk about a man who has been catapulted into the spotlight. I love that sense of accomplishment that you can see in the photograph over here on the right. Now, there were some criticisms of this effort. There were people from West Berlin who said, it's too happy, it's too cartoonish for what the wall actually is. Like there shouldn't be that much joy there. And people began to deface even his section of the wall almost immediately. Within the space of a couple months, you couldn't even see what he had contributed. Just 3 years later, of course, the Berlin Wall would come down, right? That Berlin would now be unified, and 100 days after the Berlin Wall came down, Keith Haring would die. And so now we have this idea that, the wall is no more, Keith Haring is no more. That wouldn't have mattered to him because he knew that just the photographs of what he had done were the most important part. There was that sense that like art can be ephemeral, sort of like what Christo and Jean-Claude did, a temporary installation, but the photograph would preserve it forever. Now, he kept going with big, major public works commissions. This is one of his last major murals. It was in Pisa. He was a savvy marketer. He designed this image around as sort of like a marketing campaign for this particular commission, which was on the side of a church. This was done, I believe, in 1989. He was already sick at this point. We're going to talk a little bit about his illness. And this was done just before he died. We can see that there is this new kind of wild, surrealistic freedom in the kinds of images that he was creating. It's interesting to think like what direction his artwork would have gone in had he lived. But I do just want to touch on a couple of projects that he did that were related to children too, because I find these really moving. Keith Haring executed a 6-story high mural of the Statue of Liberty on the 100th anniversary of the statue being given to the United States by France. So this is all, again, eyeballed. He's done it freehand. You can tell that the arm of the Statue of Liberty is a little bit wonky here. But in terms of color, he actually invited about 1,000 public school students from all of the boroughs in New York City to come in and add their own graffiti. They were only limited by color to his mural of the Statue of Liberty. Now, I don't know who owns this picture, but I do know that it's such a significant image that in those few months after September 11th, when the whole country was kind of reeling and looking for images and icons of unity and patriotism. Well, at the Super Bowl, in the January following the September 11th attacks, Paul McCartney performed in front of Keith Haring's mural of the Statue of Liberty. So I think that speaks to what a potent image that is. Keith Haring also contributed his artwork to the benefit of children in France. Remember how he wanted to be an artist in France when he was a little boy? We can see the Eiffel Tower in the background. There was a children's hospital where he decorated the exterior stairwell here with some of his familiar dancing and falling images, these bright patches of color. The hospital is no longer there, as you can see in the image on the right, but the stairwell was preserved. It's now known as the Keith Haring Tower. And I think you'd be so proud that it was still there. He also designed sculptures that were in this similar style. This one was executed for Long Island Children's Hospital. I'm not quite sure where this one on the right is, but we can see that Keith Haring probably would have had an amazing second career as a playground designer had he lived a little bit longer. Now, this final public work I wanted to share with you is sort of a different project. And if you read body language a little bit, you can see that he's feeling a little bit different about this. This is a mural that he executed that would ultimately go to a children's hospital, but he was invited to Washington, D.C. to make this mural on the grounds of the White House. This was 1988, and this was part of the Easter celebration there at the White House. Now, if you remember your history around AIDS, you remember that the AIDS epidemic sort of spread unchecked for quite some time because nobody wanted to address an epidemic that was primarily affecting the gay community. And so here he is at the White House contributing his artistic efforts. And apparently, one of the photographers walked up to him and sort of looked at Keith Haring and said, "What are you doing here?" And Keith Haring sort of had to grapple with that. I'm sure he was grappling with it even before he arrived there, but you can tell there's that sense of ambivalence about being at the Reagan White House when the AIDS epidemic was sort of ravaging his community, his population, particularly in New York City. So let's turn our attention fully to his work that he did as an advocate. I know that we're at 8 o'clock right now. We'll move through this pretty quickly. Keith Haring never shied away from lending his artwork towards causes that he loved. So in this case, the African Emergency Relief Fund. We already know that he was doing art as like part of anti-crack campaigns. Now, his sexuality, his identity as a gay man was, part and parcel to who he was. This is an incredible portrait of Keith Haring done in 1986. Now, the following year, Keith Haring would find out that he was HIV positive, and the year after that, 1988, he had full-blown AIDS. So Keith Haring, in this incredibly vulnerable nude portrait here by Annie Leibovitz, well, I use this as an opportunity to talk about how Keith Haring in his mind had sort of married his artistic output with his sexuality. He talked about, sort of dancing out his artwork in that his sexual energy was the strongest single impulse he felt, even more than art, but it was sort of an extension of his art as well. And so it was all bound up together, his identity as a gay man and his identity as an artist. We can go back to even some of those subway drawings and see that maybe there's even a little bit of a hint at his homosexuality in these images. I mean, we read these as archetypal characters, but are they really male characters that are in love at this point? We don't know. By the end of the 1980s, he is much more out of the closet. Here's an image for National Coming Out Day. He created another image for the anniversary of the Stonewall riot. And then, because education around safe sex was so important at this time, he would lend his imagery to that as well, knowing that communication around sex had to change. Our whole culture, our thinking around sex had to change, or else lives would be lost. So he would lend his celebrity to protests. Here he is marching and sort of confronting Ed Koch, the mayor, about this subject. But it's really his artwork that spoke loudest of all. He worked with the organization ACT UP at some point. Oftentimes he would use this variation on the three wise monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, with the X on the chest, sort of signifying that these people already had a death sentence because they were infected by AIDS. But of course, if you do not communicate around that, it just further promotes or provides the opportunity for the disease to spread, right? So sometimes he would represent the disease of AIDS as a serpent, and that like these humanoid figures could be the scissors that stop it. But he often went back to the three wise monkeys, in this case, using that pink triangle that ACT UP would oftentimes use. And he's covered the pink triangle with see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Even when he was making imagery for educational materials for teenagers, we see he's using those three wise monkeys. In this case, they don't have the X's on their chests. This was a way for them to avoid getting the X's on their chest, right? I find this image on the right just fascinating. ACT UP for life. I mean, you could easily just glance at it and just think that it's Keith Haring's dancing figures, but they have X's on their chests. These are people that have a death sentence, and their arms are up, I think, because they are exasperated, that they're looking for some sort of change, for some sort of solution. So through it all, Keith Haring was lending his artwork to any single cause that would help prevent and educate around the issue of AIDS. He established his own foundation, the Keith Haring Foundation, which had sort of a two-pronged mission. One was to help nonprofits that serve children, and then the other arm was involved in the education, prevention, and care related to AIDS. So we can see that the Haring Foundation uses that radiating baby symbol. Also, their mobile unit here is covered in Keith Haring imagery. So we sort of wrap up this section with the famous AIDS quilt that was at the on the Mall in Washington D.C. in 1989, and there were these huge quilts, usually about 15 by 15, and more than a dozen of them were sort of dedicated to Keith Haring, to his style of imagery. At this point, he's passed away. He hasn't contributed anything to this, but his memory was accessed and sort of celebrated through the AIDS quilt. And this artist who started his career beyond the boundaries of the typical art world. He didn't need to start off in a gallery or in a museum. He was in subways. Now, at this point, beyond his death, I mean, it's his legacy is spreading, beyond the size of the mall in Washington D.C. The AIDS quilt was larger than the mall. It was larger than anyone could have anticipated. So in a similar way, his impact sort of knew no bounds. We'll wrap up very quickly with his legacy. Keith Haring passed away at just the age of 31 years old. It's breathtakingly like a brief life, isn't it? So he passed away in 1990 of AIDS-related complications, and unbelievably, after his death, some art critics sort of criticized him because his style never really evolved. Well, he only worked for about 10 years. He was only 31. He didn't really even have a chance to evolve. During that very short life and career that he had, he produced about 10,000 objects of art, 50 solo shows, 50 murals around the world. He was so busy making sure that art could be for everyone. We see him here lounging in a field outside of Paris with a massive blimp with one of his images on the side of that blimp. This is a man who had fulfilled his childhood dream of becoming an artist in France. His artwork is a part of our culture now. Here's one of his dancing figures with a heart in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. I think this was back in 2008. There are numerous artists alive and working today who owe a debt of gratitude to Keith Haring and the path that he paved for them, from like the interest in celebrity of Jeff Koons here to the launch of graffiti art with Banksy, to the interest in licensing imagery with Murakami over here. I would say even the familiar logos that we have on our phones for these apps, I think all sort of derive from the simplicity of the images that Keith Haring helped to hone and craft during his career. I mean, look specifically at like the Snapchat imagery here. This really looks like Haring, right? And so, of course, he got his due with a Google Doodle not too long ago. Now, I like to just end with a quick assessment in terms of where the artist's work stands in the art world at auction today. That gives us a sense of their reputation, right? Well, these later Keith Haring works that are a little bit more dense in their imagery, a little bit more surreal, tend to go for more money. Believe it or not, the highest price any of his works have ever fetched at auction was around $6 million. And that is nothing in the art world. That is like chump change. Andy Warhol's gotten like $200 million at auction. So what does this mean? What does this mean for Keith Haring? Well, I would say that it means nothing because this is an artist that would have been just as happy if 6 million people bought like a $1 pin from him. So with that, I'll end, and I hope you have fallen in love with Keith Haring. I'll turn my attention to the chat and the Q&A right now. If you have any questions for me, I'll be happy to try and answer any of them. Oh, Rosemary, I hope I answered your question with other famous artists, people like Jeff Koons, Banksy, Murakami. A lot of artists working today, I think, owe him a debt of gratitude. I hope that's helpful. Take a look at the chat here too. Thank you, everybody, for your kind words. I really appreciate it. I sure do love Keith Haring. I hope you love him too. Um, oh, and JM says the pink triangle is the designator the Nazis used to denote homosexuals. Thanks for adding that in. Adds another layer to our understanding of those images, too. Thank you so much. And the miracle, Thomas says the miracle of birth about the vodka ads um, when they were magazines. I'm not sure I understand the comment there, but I think we get the gist of it. Oh, Stephanie, great question. What is the importance of the radiating baby? I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. So for Keith Haring, he said, like, there's there's nothing that is as important and sort of universally loved as a baby. Like it's the greatest thing that there could be. So to him, that was like the purest form of existence. And maybe those radiating lines are like the innocence of a baby, maybe it's the energy of a baby, whatever you want to do, however you interpret it. But to him, it was like the best form of human existence right there. Stephanie, thank you for asking that question. I'm sorry I didn't make that more clear. Um, oh, nice comments from people. I really appreciate it. I think I'm seeing everything here. Um, Lynn, thanks for your very kind messages. Thank you, Susan, for this. Karen Jacobson, always nice to see your Dave at these presentations. Thank you. I think that's Janine JM. Thanks for being here, Janine. Um, and I think I've seen most of these questions. Donnie says, thank you so much for me. She says, it was great to learn about Keith Haring's life. Thanks. Thank you so much, Donnie, for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. All right. Dory says, is the heart with toe hands a mural? The heart with toe hands. I'm wondering if you're asking about this image that's on the screen right now. I'm not sure. It's a little bit hard to sort of track down some of his work because he never titled anything. This is an image that's simply called Untitled from 1983. I don't think that it was a mural, but I can't say for sure. I'm sorry I don't have that info. Was he close with his family throughout his life? Catherine asked. Catherine, thank you so much for asking. We saw his parents there with Yoko Ono, and actually his sister, one of his younger sisters, wrote a book about him called Keith Haring, The Boy Who Just Kept Drawing. If you have a little artist in your life, I highly recommend this book. My 10-year-old loves this book. This book was actually used in his art class at school too. It's very kid friendly, and it's the story of a little kid who loves art and has the impulse to create art. So we can see here his sister celebrating him, and I think it says a lot that his family loved him through like the AIDS epidemic, through a time when I think it was probably difficult for a lot of people to love someone who was out of the closet and dying from this disease. And so he certainly had, that difficulty through the end of his life. And it seems as though his family stayed close to him. Deborah asked, will we be emailing the link? I think that the Chelmsford Public Library is very good about doing that, as far as I believe, but they would have the recording if by any chance you don't get it. Did he have a professional photographer working for him and traveling with him, says Pullman? At least early on in his career, he was working with a friend of his, a photographer friend of his, and I'm just going back through my notes just to make sure I have his name correctly. I believe it was, let's see, Seng Quan Chi. That is somebody who was working with him early on, like in 1983, specifically commissioned to document his subway drawings, but I'm not sure about later on. Uh, oh, Thomas adds that Herring stuff is not just the sculpture, his art is all over the halls and walls of Cohen's Children's Hospital and Lake Success. Thanks for adding that. Karen says there was a Keith Haring exhibit at the Broad in LA in 2023, I believe. I mean, he's still relevant. People are still talking about him today. Every time I give this presentation, I will admit to you, I want more merchandise. I want the pin. I want all of it. It's just so sweet. The message is so positive. It's fun and accessible art. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. Oh, somebody asked, does who gets the rights to his work? Who gets the money? Great question. I'm not entirely sure. There is the foundation. So I'm not sure if everything's licensed through the foundation now and that goes to support the causes that he cared most about. I'm not sure if some of it goes to his family. Those details not totally clear to me, but it seems like that he had a good sense in terms of a socially conscious sense in terms of how he wanted that money to be spent. April says, was there a recent postal stamp with a Keith Haring drawing? Great question, April. If there was, I missed it. I'm going to have to look that up. Maybe somebody can look that up for us right now. Thank you again, everybody, for your time and attention tonight. I'm honored that you joined me, and I look forward to seeing you next month. We've got a brand new program. It's called The Art of the Selfie. We are going to be looking at artist self-portraits. They are so fascinating. They reveal so much, and I hope to show you some, some big familiar ones that are heavy hitters, but a lot of new ones are sort of new to me at least. So that should be a lot of fun, and we'll be doing that at the end of next month. So thank you again, everybody. I always love seeing your names and your questions and comments. So take good care. Enjoy the summer months, and I will see you back in at the end of July. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.